Welcome to Black, Brilliant, and Beat, Episode 2. I'm Carleen Ponder, and I'm making a series of short videos to talk to you about my experience with chronic fatigue syndrome, primarily to help Black women and other people of color who may have symptoms but may be unaware of what chronic fatigue syndrome is, and may have trouble getting a diagnosis and therefore no relief. So in my first video, I talked to you about what chronic fatigue is, how the medical community comes to define what a diagnosis of chronic fatigue requires. And in this video, I'm going to talk to you about my experience finding medical care and some of the challenges there. Even though I was first diagnosed with this condition about 15 years ago, the challenges with finding knowledgeable medical care and today affordable medical care have persisted. So I think that other people will have experienced this, might be experiencing some of these issues that I'm going to share. And hopefully this will shed some light on what I found to be helpful, my path to getting medical care. Okay, let's get started. So, I didn't know what chronic fatigue syndrome was 15 years ago. I didn't know that term. I just happened to come across an article. I think it was a newspaper article. It might have been an opinion piece written by an author, a successful author, and this person was sharing their journey with chronic fatigue syndrome, and a lot of the difficulties, that this person documented then, some 15 years ago, are still some of the same difficulties that persist today. But that was the thing that sort of got me thinking that what I was experiencing, with this crushing fatigue that just didn't go away after a good night's sleep, and fatigue that was accompanied by other things. Some of the symptoms that accompany my fatigue include sort of flu-like symptoms. I can have what feels like swollen lymph nodes, headaches, just exhausted and kind of achy. So it's not just this unrelenting fatigue. There are all these other things that come along with it that make chronic fatigue syndrome unique and make it, what it is, identifiable. So I had to call around, medical practice after medical practice, asking whether or not there was a physician there who was knowledgeable about chronic fatigue syndrome. Generally, the answer was no, or, I just didn't get a call back. I made lots of visits to people. There were some people who said, sure, we treat fatigue, come on in. So I made lots of visits to people, and most of those ended up being unhelpful. In fact, I remember in one particular experience, I went to see a doctor, and this was a young doctor, and it was a woman doctor, who tried to convince me that my real problem was actually depression, and that chronic fatigue syndrome did not really exist. And she asserted that she knew this because of her medical studies and research and this kind of thing. And I was so frustrated during that medical appointment, with trying to convey these very real symptoms that I was having to somebody who really wanted to convince me that I had a mental health condition. I got, I became fatigued and I became frustrated during that appointment. And I said, I said that to her. I told her, one of the things that might lead to depression for somebody who has a condition that, doctors have trouble identifying, diagnosing, and treating, and even recognizing as an actual impairment. I said frustration and feeling that you just don't know where to turn for help. Now that can lead to depression. So anyway, she wasn't helpful. So I then, the recommendation was to see a specialist, to see a rheumatologist, So I remember making an appointment with a rheumatologist, and unfortunately, very similar experience. I got there, and she really did try to convince me that chronic fatigue syndrome, just didn't exist, and I must have, some other issues going on. So I think I did lab work, and there, none of the things that she actually looked for were indicative of any other problem. And she says, well, you've got a little bit of inflammation. You're tired. People in the city are tired. You work a lot. So, and that was kind of the end of it. Meanwhile, I was left to deal with these symptoms, this persistent fatigue, unrefreshed sleep, this achiness, and sort of cognitive blurriness, all on my own, until I was digging around probably on the internet somewhere, and I found a support group for people with certain conditions, and chronic fatigue syndrome was one of them. And they listed several doctors. I did make contact with one physician from this support group, and that turned out to be incredibly helpful. At the time, this person had some knowledge about some of the studies that were going on back then. I think Stanford University was conducting studies on chronic fatigue syndrome, and there was he also knew that there could be a possible link to what's called the Epstein-Barr virus in people who have chronic fatigue syndrome. And he did that lab work on me, and it did come back that I did have the Epstein-Barr virus. Perhaps it was a reactivated, virus in my system from an infection that I didn't know about years ago. I'm not sure, but he prescribed antivirals for me to take, not on a daily basis, but when I was experiencing episodes of chronic fatigue. For me, it's more of an episodic issue, meaning that on a daily basis, I don't have crushing fatigue and cognitive difficulties and the achiness and other things, but it sort of gets triggered by certain events. And so I found that for me, taking the antivirals at the first time that I was experiencing symptoms really did help quell the worst of it. Now, I know that studies said that doesn't work for everybody, but luckily for me, it was very helpful for a period of time. And so I worked with him on some other things too. We looked at some dietary things such as, gluten sensitivity, and, so there were certain food modifications that I made that were also very helpful at the time. Now, that worked reasonably well for a few years, and then for some reason I began to worsen. I don't know what it was. It could have been, just the aging process. Who knows? So, but when I needed to go back for additional help, this particular doctor was no longer available. And so there I was again, having to start the process of looking all over. Only this time I was in dire straits. This was, I think, around 2016, 2017, and I broke out with the shingles twice, y'all. In a period of 2 years, I had the shingles. And the shingles are really, they're prevalent with the elderly population. So, so that was unusual. And the fact that I had it, almost back to back. No explanation other than, my primary care said, well, your immune system seems to be weak. You must be under a lot of pressure. You must be under a lot of stress. And I was just thinking, why is my immune system so weak that I keep, that I'm getting shingles? And really no answer there. So as things began to progress, I remember going to a Zumba class in the morning and really working out and having a good time. And when I got home, I started to have this shallow breathing. Again, almost like somebody who's experiencing some kind of cardiac issue. Shallow breathing, and just my heart rate was a little funny. I was super fatigued. This was probably 1 p.m. or so in the afternoon. I remember sitting on my couch that afternoon and not moving until the next day. That's how tired I was. And so, like I said, with chronic fatigue syndrome, it's almost as if, your energy is contained in like an hourglass, some sort of sand timer hourglass container, and it just drips and drips and drips, and just doesn't get replenished. So I ended up being super, super drained, I ended up being beat for a good 2 weeks. It might have been 3 weeks even. And unfortunately, that's what happens. When you have an episode, it can last anywhere from a day, 3 days, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, longer. And I was desperate. So there I was calling around again to try and find medical help. And I was breaking out in hives. That was unusual too. I had all these new skin rashes going on. I remember going to a dermatologist who said, well, you might have cancer. Oh my God. She jumped right to cancer. I didn't have cancer, thank goodness. But that was scary. But, so the weird thing about chronic fatigue syndrome is that you can get a bunch of new symptoms that you've never had before. They seem unrelated, but yet they are. So I'm going to stop here and take a quick pause because I want to put up some slides from some of the folks who do more research on this. And there's a little bit of information that you might find helpful here about how wacky some of these symptoms can be, how they can just appear, they can just pop up. So, finally, one of my existing doctors told me, and is complaining about my symptoms and that nobody knew how to treat chronic fatigue syndrome. One of my existing doctors said to me, well, I do know that is a real issue. It tends to strike women, more often than men, and I know that it can really be very difficult, especially for people, who work, because you got to be able to conserve enough energy to get up and get yourself to work and do what you have to do without your body breaking down on you. And so he said, I might know somebody who knows somebody. And through this connection, I did end up finding a doctor who was like my angel at the time, just my angel. And, just a true godsend because she knew about chronic fatigue syndrome. I was immediately validated. I told her about all of the strange symptoms that I was having, the shallow breathing, breaking out in hives, the shingles, and she was like, yep, and like almost checking off a list. She realized that all of these things could be related and that really what we had to do together was to work on getting my immune system healthier, and we did do that. And again, it was a lot of dietary stuff. There were some things in my diet that she wanted me to take out, so I did. I went mostly to a plant-based diet, which I really need to get back to. It was helpful, but I did a lot of I got a lot of like omegas from eating certain fish, and just worked on getting good good products that would put in help with like gut bacteria and all that kind of thing. And we had to make some lifestyle, I had to work on my lifestyle in terms of learning about what we call pacing in the world of chronic fatigue syndrome. So pacing, the way that it got explained to me that I really understood was, imagine when you wake up in the morning, you have 6 spoons. So you just have to think about what needs to be done throughout your day with each of the 6 spoons. Now you may wake up the next day and only have 5 spoons. You might have to get the same amount of things done in that day, but you only have 5 spoons, which means you got some decisions to make about how you're going to conserve your energy, given that it's less than it was the day before. Now, I have trouble saying no. I am a compulsive overdoer. I do lots of things that I really enjoy. I do a lot of work in the community, and just a lot of volunteer projects that I get myself involved in that take up time and they take up energy, but they also give me a sense of purpose and being. So, but sometimes I have a tendency to overdo it, and the pacing piece I struggle with. And what ends up happening with chronic fatigue is if it's a day when you have 5 spoons, or God forbid you got less than that, you got 4 spoons or 3 spoons when you wake up in the morning, but you have a full day, of work and then activities that you're involved in after work, if your energy is already short and it's steadily draining throughout the day, and you try and push yourself to go beyond, the energy level that you have to keep commitments, which to me is a big deal to try and keep my commitments, I pay a price. I end up having what we call a crash. And a crash is like when my body just goes haywire. Everything breaks down. I start hurting all over, just pain. The headaches, the cognitive decline, it gets in there. I mean, I remember one day, y'all, taking public transportation home from my normal route, standing on the train tracks, being unable to figure out what train to get on. That's how bad it was. Nothing was working. Everything had gone haywire. And during those periods, I become really, really irritable. So, so avoiding a crash really is the best way to have longevity and without hurting yourself when you have chronic fatigue syndrome. So that's still something I continue to have to work on today. But so I got better during that period. It was roughly a 2-year period when I was working with this particular doctor. My immune system strengthened. I felt really good. And of course, I'm sure I was overdoing things all over again. Now, unfortunately, that practitioner is no longer available either. And so what I'm now learning today is that we do have more medical practitioners who are knowledgeable about chronic fatigue syndrome. A lot of them will be called integrative or functional medicine practitioners, but many of them are not affiliated with insurance plans or don't accept insurance, which means that you typically have to pay for each visit, or you have to pay for so many visits up front, something like that. And this can be in the thousands, and not to mention lab work. Oftentimes they do lab work that traditional insurance also doesn't cover. So definitely issues of concern there. And another reason why I wanted to make this video was because I know that, as I suffered, with this disease, and I've had so much trouble finding medical practitioners, that for other people, particularly for people who have challenges, with health insurance, maybe they don't have access to employer-sponsored health insurance, or the thought of being able to shell out several $1,000s for a couple of doctor's visits is out of the question. Then unfortunately what we're talking about is issues of issues of inequity, and I know that will hit black people, black women, and people of color especially hard. So that's another thing to really start to dig into, I guess, as we have more awareness about these, I don't know if you want to call them newer health conditions or what, but as we have more awareness about what needs to be done policy-wise so that people aren't needlessly suffering. So in my next video, what I want to do is talk to you about some of the tips that I have, techniques that I use to stay active and to really have a full life. You know, even though I have this impairment that, you know, at times really is disabling and can prevent me from doing things that I otherwise want to engage in. But I've been able to live a really full, really active life, and I do acknowledge that part of that is I've also been able to find medical care that has been tremendously helpful to me. Sporadic, but helpful. So that'll be my next video, and I hope that this is helpful. If there are questions that you have for me, please put them in the chat and I will answer them. Thank you.